Once again, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us in today's event. The program will begin shortly. Please note that this webinar is being recorded and is also being live streamed on Facebook. To those who have just joined us, welcome. Hey, once again, thank you everyone for joining us. It is now 4 o'clock p.m. Philippine Standard Time. Good day from the sunny country of the Philippines. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to friends and guests who are joining us from other parts of the globe. My name is Daniel C. Radilla, the Program Officer for Climate and Disaster Resilience at the Ateneo Institute of Sustainability, and I will be serving as your host for today's event. It is my honor to welcome you all to the 2024 Climate Research as If People Mattered webinar series. This session is entitled Gendering Climate Change Impacts, Placing Women's Human Rights at the Forefront. This is the second and penultimate session of our climate research webinar series, picking up from last week's session. Today, in particular, we will be exploring the intersections between gender and climate impacts. This webinar series is organized by the My Climate Risk Ateneo de Manila University Regional Hub, which is hosted by the Ateneo Institute of Sustainability. My Climate Risk, or MCR, is a lighthouse activity of the World Climate Research Program, which aims to develop and mainstream a bottom-up approach to regional climate risks. This starts with a better understanding of local contexts and the requirements of decision makers, hence our webinar series, where we will explore the different contexts and experiences of climate change. In this webinar series in particular, we explore how these different contexts and experiences are considered and how we might apply these to our research design and management plans. Today's session will take a look at using the human rights-based approach in analyzing the situation of women affected by climate change. Climate impacts are and will continue to be felt unequally around the world, whether among or within nations. And this is particularly true when we consider the impacts that will be felt by women. And we'll learn more about this in today's session. So it's very nice to see some familiar names join us in today's event. I see that our numbers are steadily growing as the hour progresses. But if this is your first time joining one of our webinars, we hope that you stick around and hopefully join the growing community by climate risk. We'd also like to thank our colleagues from the Ateneo School of Law and the wider Ateneo community for your support. Just some quick reminders for everyone before we start. Please note that the program is being recorded on Zoom. On Zoom, all participants are muted automatically as they enter the meeting room. Throughout the session, kindly type in any comments or questions in the chat box here on Zoom. Participants via Facebook Live may also type in their comments or questions in the comments section. We will collect these for the open forum later on. And finally, there will be an evaluation survey at the end of the session. Requests for certificates may be made through the same. At this point in the program, we'd like to ask everyone to settle in for the prayer to be followed by the Philippine national anthem. I now invite everyone to make the sign of their faith and join me as we recite the benediction, a Hawaiian prayer for the earth. Let us give thanks for the world around us. Thanks for all the creatures, stones, and plants. Let us learn their lessons and seek their truths, so that their path might be ours, and we might live in harmony, a better life. May the earth continue to live. May the heavens above continue to live. May the rains continue to dampen the land. May wet forests continue to grow. Then the flowers shall bloom, and we people shall live again.
Bayang magiliw, pelas ang sinanganan, alam ng puso, sa dibdib mo'y buhay. Lupang hinirang, duyan ka ng magiting, sa manlulupig, di ka pasisiin. Sa dagat at bundok, sa simoy at sa langit mong bukaw, may nilagang tula at awit sa paglayang minamahal. Ang kislap ng watawat mo'y tagumpay na nagdiningning, ang bituin at araw niya kailan pa may magdidilim. Lupa ng araw ng walhating pagsinta, buhay langit sa piling mo. Aming ligaya na pag may mga api, ang mamatay ng dahil sa'yo.
Now, to formally welcome everyone to today's webinar, it is my honor and pleasure to call on Dr. Nikki Garci Cruz. She is the chair of the Department of Interdisciplinary Studies at the Ateneo de Manila University and a collaborator of the My Climate Risk Ateneo de Manila University Regional Hub. Dr. Garci Cruz, the floor is.
Good afternoon. Climate impacts affect people in unique ways. Impacts are distributed differently depending on gender, age, income group, and so forth. Climate change tends to exacerbate existing gender inequalities, which lead women to face larger negative impacts. And that is why we constantly need to see things through a gender lens. We need to constantly be mindful of historically and culturally specific patterns of relationships and social institutions that perpetuate gender inequality, that serve as a base for hazardous conditions that place particular groups of women at greater risk. Where are the women when it comes to climate change? When ocean temperatures rise and coral bleaching takes place due to thermal stress, isn't the loss of coral reefs something that will impact women working in the tourism industry? When drought leads to water shortages, isn't it primarily women who manage water resources at home, affecting their livelihood and increasing their workload? When disasters strike, the figures always yield a higher death rate for women. Access to medical services is always less for them when epidemics break out. And their workload is always higher in terms of caring for the sick. When loss of species happen, so many women who rely on crop diversity have to adjust to the effects of climatic variability and reduced agrobiodiversity, because it is women who usually know about and use foraging, make use of traditional medicine options, and so on. The list goes on and on for how women, because of their unique capabilities, are affected in a very unique way. So I find it very inspiring that today's climate research webinar is about gendering climate change impacts and placing women's human rights at the forefront. It is important to emphasize that human rights is a starting point, should be the starting point, as a starting point in uncovering the inequalities that disadvantage women. But this is not just because we want to know how to protect women's rights. It's also about respecting the rights to equal treatment before the law, to equitable distribution and access to benefits, and to ensure their participation in decision making regarding adaptation and mitigation efforts, policies, and mechanisms. This is not just about women as victims, but this is about empowering women as agents of change. I'm very excited that Ateneo de Manila University, through the Ateneo Institute of Sustainability and the Asia Pacific Hub of the My Climate Risk, through this lighthouse activity, invited attorney Ryan Jeremiah Donato Juan of the Ateneo School of Law to be our resource speaker today. Since we are in the business of speaking as if people mattered, let me speak as a person about Ryan as a person. I've had the great honor of being able to see a little bit of his life as a student leader 30 years ago. And I am able to see that Ryan has blossomed in terms of his work, in terms of his advocacy, human rights, and as well as his research and publications. And also his vocation, which goes beyond just advocacy, but also the spiritual aspects. Ryan is somewhat a coach of mine who went ahead and is teaching me in my formation as well. So for today's talk, I'm very excited to hear from Ryan, from his experience, from his research, and for him to remind us to fine-tune our gender lenses so that we could see, listen, hear, and engage climate change topics from the perspective of a practitioner. Ryan may not be a woman. It's not his fault, but it is important for everyone, all of us, to have a gender lens. Men, women alike, everybody in the world. It is important for us to have a gender lens, and activities like this allow us to keep fine-tuning our lenses. Thank you very much, and I hope that we enjoy the conversation that will follow, what I am sure will be an inspiring presentation by Ryan. Welcome, everybody.
Thank you very much, Dr. Carcy Cruz, for welcoming us all to today's session and for reminding us of the importance of using a gender lens to inspect context and also looking at the larger context that inform the present that we live in. Indeed, our webinar series carries the phrase, as if people mattered. And today we will take a look at how we can be intentional at looking at these disproportionate impacts to women in particular and see how we can surely make everyone matter. So now it is my pleasure to introduce our speaker for today's session. We are very lucky to be joined by Ryan Jeremiah Donato Kwan. He is a full-time human rights and labor law professor at the Ateneo de Manila University School of Law, or ALS. He is concurrently the coordinator of the Graduate Legal Studies Institute, the ALS unit in charge of internationalization efforts, and the Master of Laws program. He's also the research coordinator of the ALS and conducts bar review lectures on labor law and social legislation, and is also a member of the University Research Council. Ryan's areas of teaching and research include international human rights law, women's rights and gender issues, labor and employment law, child's rights, business and human rights education, and environmental issues in the context of human rights. He has articles and book chapters on these themes published both locally and internationally. He was previously a legal specialist at the Commission on Human Rights of the Philippines and continues to serve as consultant to international agencies and institutes on development issues and human rights. Ryan completed his undergraduate degrees in development studies and legal management at De La Salle University, Manila in 2004. He then obtained his Juris Doctor degree from Ateneo in 2008 and was admitted to the Philippine Bar in 2009. In 2015, he was conferred a Master of Laws in International Human Rights Law degree, summa cum laude, by the University of Notre Dame du Lac at Indiana, USA, where he was a scholar of its Clow Institute for Civil and Human Rights. Please join me in welcoming our very decorated and esteemed speaker, our colleague from the School of Law, Attorney Ryan Jeremiah Donato Kwan. Attorney Kwan, we hand over the floor to you.
Thank you very much for the very generous introduction, Daniel. Before I continue on, allow me to first of all express my gratitude to the Ateneo Institute of Sustainability for this invitation to speak for this afternoon session. When I first received the invitation, I was like, okay, how can we say no to this? But when I saw the publicity materials that came out, okay, I am sandwiched between two giants. How do we go about this? But I guess we trudge through, if you will, and we continue on what we and try to share to the best of our abilities what we have done and what we hope to contribute to this area of climate change and gender. Of course, thank you also, Dr. Nikki Carce Cruz, and she, as she mentioned, we met each other decades ago, and true to the, I guess, true to friendship's sake, she kind of gave an overview of my presentation for this afternoon. Thank you very much. And that was without her seeing what my presentation looked like. So I guess, yeah, friends do click and the friends can think alike. Without further ado, I would like to begin this. Let me share my screen. Um, Yep. Okay, there you are. So I entitled this session "Gendering Climate Change Impacts: Placing Women's Human Rights at the Forefront." Primarily because not only because it's about gender and climate change, but I'd like us to see like what Nikki mentioned earlier, see climate change, the issue of climate change, not solely from a scientific perspective or hard science perspective, but also from a human rights lens, and more specifically, a gender lens. My foray into this area of climate change and gender and climate change began almost a decade ago. This was because my own work really a lot of my own work revolved around gender issues, gender equality issues. But I had when I was in law school, I had an internship with an environmental NGO, and I thought I didn't want to leave out my environmental advocacy and try to in the context of my work, in the context of which is an advocacy in itself, and my own personal advocacy, where can they meet? And at that time, in 2013, 2014, there wasn't much work done on the area of gender and climate change, and I thought this could be something worth pursuing. So through the course of this, in the next 35 minutes or so, allow me to share my thoughts on the matter, and I hope that you would all get something out of this. The outline of my presentation for this afternoon would begin with climate change and its impacts on women. And then when at the point that I will share with you the disproportionate and the differential impacts of climate change, I would also I intend also to share my reflections from my research work and data gathering, as well as desk research in the years that I've been doing work on climate change and human rights, not only in terms of research, but also in terms of programs when I do my work with international agencies or previously with the Commission on Human Rights. And then since we are talking about climate research, I would like to invite you to look at the human rights based approach and gender mainstreaming concepts. These two concepts are largely programmatic concepts, but could be useful as guides in climate research. And I'll end with key takeaways that I hope we would sum up what we discussed for this afternoon. Again, allow me again a big thank you to the Ateneo Institute of Sustainability for having me. It is a great honor to be presenting in this webinar series. Okay, let me begin. I begin with this premise that climate change affects our lives, and this is better explained by scientists. But and even the UN Human Rights Council, as early as 2009, recognized that an increase in global average temperatures of approximately 2 degrees Celsius will have major and predominantly negative effects on ecosystems across the globe, on the goods and services they provide. Climate change then is among the most important drivers of ecosystem changes, along with the overexploitation of resources and pollution. Global warming will exacerbate the harmful effects of environmental pollution, including higher levels of ground level ozone in urban areas. So this is an excerpt actually from the initial report of the United Nations Human Rights Council on the relationship between climate change and human rights. So this is among the earliest studies pertaining to human rights and climate change that the UN human rights system produced. The you Of course, because when we speak of human rights are said to be interrelated. They are indivisible. They are universal across the entire world. Um, which means that human rights are impacted by climate change. All human rights are impacted by climate change. But just to illustrate to you the human rights impacts of climate change, I outlined, based from the report also, at least four rights that are directly impacted by climate change. Again, this aren't kind of as a kind of caveat. These four are not the only human rights that are affected. But these are the usual four. Let me begin with the right to life. The right to life can cause death. Extreme weather events like cyclones, typhoons, heat waves, floods, and droughts can affect the right to life, because a lot of these events can cause deaths, and we saw that in the Philippine context, at least in 2013, when Super Typhoon Haiyan, or Yolanda, locally known as Yolanda, hit the Philippines. It was an extreme weather event, killed thousands of lives. The right to food security would be affected not only by torrential rains, but also by longer periods of drought that may lessen crop production. The heat wave that we are probably experiencing at this point is an example of these. Example of this. If we It is not hard to imagine that if this heat that we are experiencing right now gets prolonged, our crop production will definitely decrease. So and then the other one is the right to water. Apart from droughts and severe weather events, the rising of sea levels can lead to the intrusion of salt water into fresh water sources. The right to water, while it is not a right that is explicitly stated or explicitly included in the international instruments on human rights, at least the binding instruments on human rights. This has been recognized by the United Nations Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights Committee as a right that is related and attached to the right to an adequate standard of living. Okay? The right to health is also affected because rising temperature causes heat waves. And so like what we are having right now. And then the rise of temperatures also give also occasion, rather, the higher incidences of mosquito-borne diseases. This is most especially true in a lot of tropical countries. Malaria, dengue, chikungunya, name it, all these mosquito-borne diseases we find in a lot of the tropical countries, and this, of course, affects the right to health. So these are the more general human rights impacts of climate change. But let me go to the gendered impacts of climate change, and I premise the discussion on gendered impacts of climate change to this basic phrase that climate change is not gender neutral. climate change is always said to, I mean, climate change will affect everyone in the world, regardless of where you are, what your status in life, economic status, etc. But climate change would have a different and disproportionate impact to those who are already in the state of vulnerability or marginalized sectors. And among these marginalized sectors or vulnerable sectors are women. Um, the impact of women is the different impact or the disproportionate impact of climate change to women is largely due to the intersecting vulnerabilities and historical discrimination. We'll talk about this more in detail in a bit. So in one of the first articles I wrote on climate change and gender, I said there that the lack of gender sensitive programs and policies and the continuing discrimination that women face due to societal norms, structures, and attitudes affect women's capabilities to adapt to phenomenon like climate change. So these the societal norms and structures pertain to power relations between men and women, for example, if we just look at binary sexes, but also about attitudes, social gender roles, for example, that are attached to women, which are socially constructed, may affect women's capability to to adapt to climate change. We'll go to that more in a bit. So I'm putting it out there. Climate change is not gender neutral. The effect, again, of climate change will be to all people, but there will be groups and sectors which will be differently affected, and among them will be women or are women. Okay. So it's not gender neutral. Climate change affects women differently. Some of these points were mentioned by Nikki earlier. The livelihood of women are usually affected by climate change impacts, droughts, typhoons, severe weather events, as some people refer to these strong typhoons and storms, would affect the livelihood of women across the world. Many women are still engaged in agriculture. And because they are largely reliant on agriculture, the unpredictable weather patterns will affect the yields that they produce out of farms. Not only in farm, when I speak of agriculture here, we also speak of fisheries. No? So the inability to produce the usual yield will affect the livelihood. How does this impact women differently? Something related to gender roles. When women are not able to meet the desired output, that or not desired output, when women are not able to meet a quota, if you will, that they need to a certain level of income that they need to feed their children, they are forced to seek other sources of livelihood. But in many societies, women are not favored in terms of schooling. Like if the family cannot send all children to school, the boys will be preferred to go to school. In a lot of in some areas in the Philippines, there's that common connotation that allow the boys to go to school because the girls, they will just marry later on, and the boys and the men they will marry will provide for them. That has far-reaching implications. And because of the lack of schooling, in some areas that I was doing program work in prior, some years back at least, that poses a problem because if women have no choice but to look for alternative livelihood, but they lack training, they lack education, that inhibits or that limits their capability to be able to adapt the changing environment. that becomes a problem. Let's go to the area of health. I mean, when I mentioned earlier the mosquito-borne diseases, but because of traditional gender roles that are assigned to women, look at this photo. In this slide, women are in more traditional societies are tasked to gather water. Who are the ones who craft policies? It's usually men, without due consideration for women who are sometimes without due consideration for women who are pregnant, or women who would need to walk far distances, sometimes even in areas where there are armed conflict situations. So their health, not only their health, but their life is at risk because they are the ones who are tasked to gather water. So this is a different impact on women, in that if their concerns or their roles are not considered when planning out the design of a village, for example, that would be that would pose not only health but also life threatening situations for women. Natural disasters and their aftermath. Nikki did also mention something about um, uh, um, disaster risk reduction and management. Let me dig a bit deeper. Apart from lack of skills, let me start with lack of skills. She mentioned survival skills. When I started doing research on gender and climate change, I did not pay attention much to this lack of skills in the context of disasters. In my head, then everyone will be affected by natural disasters. Until I came across literature documenting the survival rates in the Indian Ocean tsunami in the 2000s. In one of the South Asian countries that was affected by the Indian Ocean tsunami, many women were not able to survive. Why? Because when the tsunami hit, they are not skilled to go up trees. The men were. Why? Because when they were small, the girl when they're in the context of their probably culture, um, women shouldn't be going up trees. It's the job of men. But because of that lack of skill, easily they couldn't go up easily they it's not very difficult to imagine that they cannot go up trees. Add to that their attire, the long dresses that they wore also made it difficult for them to survive the onslaught of the tsunami. And then discrimination in access to services. There are, when we were doing research, a post Yolanda research in a municipality in Leyte. There were reports there that uh, the 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 relief goods were usually given to the heads of households, and those distributing the relief goods were looking for the men who were the heads of households. How about those who how about those families whose like the father passed away because of the storm, because of the typhoon? The women had to wait. In the meantime, their children were starving, right? Um, I also came across interesting literature that um explored the cross section of the effects of natural disasters and gender-based violence. I will go to that more in a bit, but it's something related to natural disasters and the aftermath. Migration and displacement also happens after disasters, especially after disasters happen. Migration and displacement also happens. The temporary displacement would usually be in evacuation facilities. In the Philippine context, disaster risk reduction, a big chunk of disaster risk reduction is about evacuation centers. The problem with these evacuation centers is that a lot of our evacuation centers were not made to be evacuation centers, especially in the provinces. What are used as evacuation centers are actually public schools. What is the problem? A lot. These structures are not built to be are not built to be evacuation centers. There are sure hygiene facilities. There are toilets in these public schools, but of course, these hygiene facilities were designed or are designed for school children. They are not meant to stay in school the whole day and sleep there. But of course, if it's an evacuation center, the families are expected to stay there for at least a couple of days. The hygiene facilities would not be enough for cooking, for bathing, and doing and accommodating suddenly a large number of people in that area. But apart from that, in the course of several research, of field research that we conducted, a very big problem also in evacuation centers is the lack of women and child friendly spaces. Specific to women, there are most evacuation centers do not have lactation facilities. The most of the quote unquote rooms are just divided by a curtain, sometimes a blanket if you're lucky. But for the most part, it's one common area. It poses risks on women, especially in relation to the next point, which is gender-based violence. Rape cases happen in evacuation centers because women do not have private areas to do to nurse their infants, even to just change. No, so that is a very serious problem. And when these cases of gender-based violence also occur, uh, one problem that we normally observe in these evacuation centers is the low visibility of law enforcement agents. Okay, and to be more specific, the low visibility, if there are any, very low visibility of female law enforcement agents. We have to understand that when women suffer from gender-based violence, it is very difficult to report such situation to a man, or at least to a male figure. Gender sensitivity dictates that there should at least be women whom they can go to immediately to report what happened to them. That is part, I think, of gender sensitivity programming. Um, I mentioned earlier about the aftermath of disasters in relation to gender-based violence. This was pretty interesting. And this pertains to stereotypes. Right? This pertains to stereotypes. Um, you know how we were, or at least many of us, were taught that men or boys shouldn't be crying, and it's okay for girls to cry. Leads to bottled up emotions and leads to some people not knowing how to express how they feel because of traditional gender. So I came across this psychology related study that detailed the experiences of women that suffer domestic violence after disasters. Um, when so the domestic violence that they experience are normally occasioned by their husbands as perpetrators, because the income stream of the men are affected by the disasters. So the income stream is affected. They are not able to provide for their families fully, but our society dictates that men should be able to provide fully for their family. That causes a psychological strain on them, and because they are not able, or some of them are not able to express what they feel or process their emotions, these bottled up emotions are well, for lack of a better term, translated to domestic violence. The women bear the brunt of that domestic violence. Pretty interesting research, I think, or area, a pretty interesting area of research, I think, that can be explored further. One other incidents that related to gender-based violence that we have noticed is that in areas in post-disaster situations, and this is not only for weather-related events. This is also true for human induced or human induced disasters like armed conflict situations. After these disasters and in these post-disaster scenarios, TIP, trafficking in persons or trafficking in women, actually increase. The incidences of trafficking in women actually increase. Why? Because women are forced to look for other ways to be able to feed their children. And in some evacuation centers, there are anecdotal data that there are tents where women are able to barter sex for food. And they do that so that they are able to feed their children. That's gender based violence staring right in front of our faces. So coming off that discussion, these are let me share with you the common women's rights violations that I already mentioned earlier in relation to the disproportionate impact of climate change to women. Discrimination in education. As I mentioned earlier, boys are preferred to go to school. This leads to a lack of education or training to adapt to situations like climate change. This includes a lot of skills that are not learned, or the skills that women should be learning, such as managing financial matters, looking for alternative sources of livelihood. Training is very important, and when girls are discriminated in terms of education, that would have long-term effects on not only on the person of the woman, but also to the family or even to the bigger society much later on. Stereotyping in gender roles. It was mentioned also earlier that women are doubly burdened when disasters hit. I mentioned the gathering of water earlier. It is not, if fresh water sources dry up, it is up to the women because of their traditional gender roles to look for alternative sources of water. And I mentioned this earlier, it's health hazards and security threats, especially in conflict areas. But also, to add to this, because of traditional gender roles such as managing the household, women are doubly burdened in post-disaster scenarios because apart from doing what they supposedly need to do in the house, like taking care of the children, cooking for them, washing their clothes, after disasters hit, when a house is flooded, who is in charge of who is in charge of cleaning up? It's the women and girls. Sometimes the young girls have to help their mother clean up their houses, thereby causing them to miss classes when schools go back after disasters. So this affects the education of girls, where they are not in a sense not disfavored to go to school. Another issue I think that should be looked at would be public participation. Because of their household work that I mentioned earlier, women may not be able to engage in the public discourse. This is not only this women's participation is not only because women should be participating for the heck of participating, but women should be allowed to participate. Not what which means what I'm trying to say is that women should be allowed to participate because it's not only because it is their right to do so, but because in being able to participate in the public discourse. For example, consultations when policies, laws, or programs are made in communities, women's needs and women's concerns should be surfaced when these discussions go about. And this shows, no, for example, a very common example, when we gather relief goods for distribution to evacuation centers. What are the common contents of a pack of relief goods? Rice, canned goods, noodles, candles. We forget that women have different needs. They need, even in a flooded situation, women need feminine hygiene products. And that is normally not considered. See, if women are allowed to participate in planning these programs, they would have an input. Hey, don't forget the feminine hygiene products. Women in households need them, right? But apart from that, I think that because of the rich experience of women in communities, when they are left in communities, in the villages with the children, they take care of the children when men work, when the men go to work following traditional gender roles. The experiences and the knowledge of women are actually treasure troves of solutions to problems that are related to climate change. We have to be able to harness these experiences and this rich knowledge for us to be able to find a more sustainable solution to problems that are caused by climate change impacts. Discrimination in terms of health. There are some societies that favor men and boys in the provision of goods. I mentioned this earlier, as well as this medicines and medicines during disaster situations. In post-disaster situations, a lot of, and we saw this also during COVID, that the provision of sexual and reproductive health services and products were hampered because as these are seen as not so important as maybe food, no, but it is not the case. These are very important products and services that should be made available to women, especially those who need them for to treat diseases and specific health conditions that they may have. Okay. At this point, let me present to you two concepts. I mentioned earlier the human rights-based approach and gender mainstreaming. When we speak of human rights-based approach, this is a conceptual framework that's based on that essentially tells us that international human rights standards and norms should be considered in crafting laws, crafting policies, designing programs, etc., so that inequalities will be analyzed and laws, policies, and programs will address discriminatory practices and unjust distributions of power. Um, so are looking so understanding the differential impacts of climate change to women is only the first step, or the human rights impacts of climate change is just the first step. After being able to analyze them following the human rights-based approach, we should be able to look at whether the responses to these problems or to these violations are in line with international human rights standards. Let me go back to this more in a bit. The second concept I'd like to bring to the fore is gender mainstreaming. As defined by the Economic and Social Council of the United Nations in 1997, it is a process of assessing the implications for women and men of any planned action, including legislation, policies, and programs in all areas and at all levels. It is actually a strategy to make sure that all the concerns of everyone, men and women, and their experiences are experiences form part of the design, implementation, and monitoring and evaluation of policies and programs. And of course, the primary purpose of gender mainstreaming is to achieve gender equality, to ensure that both men and women benefit equally and inequality is not perpetuated. When we speak of the human rights-based approach and gender mainstreaming, we also need to talk about rights holders and duty bearers. Traditionally, in human rights speak or in the human rights discourse, the rights holders are individuals, you and me, who have rights under international law and under domestic law, and the duty bearers are governments. These are the states that are the primary duty bearers that should be able to fulfill largely three obligations: to respect, protect, and to fulfill human rights. So the main duty bearers should still be governments. If you notice, the human rights-based approach and gender mainstreaming is are programmatic strategies. These are programmatic strategies, and these approaches, if you look at this slide, are generally addressed to states as primary duty bearers. But I think that when we analyze the impacts of climate change and their relationship to human rights and to gender, we are also adopting parts of the human rights-based approach and gender mainstreaming. I think that these concepts are useful in conducting research, as considering human rights and gender issues in the climate change discourse recognizes the recognizes the inherent dignity of the human person. And when we conduct research, I believe that the dignity of the person should be at the core and center. Our advocacy of caring for research participants, including everything that has to do with research ethics, etc., considers human rights and gender, the human rights of the subjects, as well as the gender issues that come with these climate change impacts. Another thing I think that we need to look at is that um the importance of considering human rights and gender and do when we do our research will affect laws, policies, and programs, because these laws, policies, and programs, whether by government or civil society, are based, or at least supposed to be based, on research. Evidence should always presuppose the laws, policies, and programs that are being implemented, or the laws that are being passed, the policies that are being adopted. So if we are able, I think, to infuse in our research when we are able to infuse in our climate research laws, gender and human rights issues, and these are analyzed properly, we are actually doing something that would contribute to the reduction, if not the total elimination, of women's rights violations when climate change impacts them. Some key takeaways for our session this afternoon. I began with this statement that climate change is not gender neutral because their impacts disproportionately the climate change impact disproportionately affect women, and of course other vulnerable sectors. A one size fits all, or a generic response then to climate related issues just do not work. We have to be able to consider the differential impacts of women, the traditional gender roles that women have, even assuming, I mean, of course, we would want to change this. We would want to also take a second look at these gender roles, because some of them may be discriminatory against women. But because they exist, you also have to work around them to make sure that in the immediate, women's rights are not sacrificed. Prevailing inequalities such as poverty, unequal power relations between men and women, the historical discrimination that women face will affect women's and girls' abilities to adapt to climate change impacts. I mentioned this earlier in terms of discrimination in education. The traditional gender roles that women have to do when in households and in communities, and their lack of education because of the of prevailing norms will affect their ability to adapt to the various climate change impacts. And then women's abilities, women's knowledge and experiences actually would benefit everyone. I'd always say that sustainable climate action would always entail a feminist lens. Women's rights and women's issues should be part of the consideration when we make programs, when we make laws and policies. Finally, research and data, and that's what we produce largely, are actually tools for women empowerment. Who are the beneficiaries actually of the work that we do? It's the society in general. And if we are able to put out their research and data for women to understand their situation, what they can do, to what they can do, and what inhibits their actions, we are actually helping them help themselves towards women empowerment. Let me leave you with this quote by Mary Robinson. Mary Robinson was a former president of Ireland and the former UN Secretary General's envoy on climate change. We often see, or we often perceive climate change as as a realm of the sciences, more so the hard sciences. But as she said, climate change is not just the language of scientists. It is the language and issues of women, the people of the world, and it is found on global justice and intergenerational justice. The decisions we make today will have huge impacts on future generations. I think that this quote is important. Is an important reminder for us that climate change impacts would differently affect women. But let me extend this a bit. Let me leave you with this last three thoughts. That human rights is not only about killings and detentions. When we speak of human rights, it's often about people. The initial perception of people is the extrajudicial killings, those who are detained because of political reasons. And yes, they are human rights issues, but human rights actually is about our daily lives. And the climate change impacts affect our daily lives. The heat that we are experiencing at this particular time, if you are in the Philippines, especially if you are in Metro Manila, it is about our daily lives. And human rights is not only the concern of lawyers and policymakers, it is everyone's concern. I would always say that all of us are and should be human rights advocates, right? And that gender equality is not only the concern of women. I'd like to pick up something that Nikki mentioned. Yes, not my fault that I am not a woman, but I think it also sends a good message that it's a male figure speaking to you about women's rights. I think that's a big win. Not to uh, uh, because it sends a message across that it's not only female figures who should be talking about women empowerment. Everyone should be talking about gender equality because everyone has a stake and has a role in creating a gender equal society that benefits present and future generations. I end with that, and I hope you got a little something from the last 40 minutes or so. Thank you very much to the Ateneo Institute of Sustainability, and thank you everyone for joining us this afternoon. Maraming salamat for listening, and I hope you got a little something out of our session this afternoon.
Thank you very much, Attorney Kwan. That was a very eye-opening session, even for those of us who perhaps already have some background knowledge on how gender and climate are intertwined. This was really a very welcome refresher and really a reminder of how we can thread together all of these connections. And what really struck me is the line that climate change is not gender neutral. um, really helps us become more aware of how we really can't separate a lot of the historical and the contextual factors that form how we uh, are vulnerable to climate impacts and how we experience them one way or another. It's also a good reminder that the pursuit of elevating women is gender equality and not necessarily to elevate one gender binary over the other. So at this point of the program, we will now be having our open forum. We've gathered some of your questions from the chat. A lot of these were sent anonymously. So for those in our audience who also prefer to send their questions in anonymously, please do so either to myself or to our tech team. So our first question, this audience member is interested in your scholarly work, Attorney Kwan. They ask, where can we access your research on gender and climate change and disasters? Or perhaps if you have a preferred platform or website where you keep an updated list of this.
I'd like to say that it's in the Arcium. I think it is in the Ateneo Arcium. It should be there. There are in case there are some of the full texts are not available there, please do. I will put in my email address in the chat box. Please send me an email. I can send you a copy of what of the work that is not there on the Archium of Ateneo. Yes.
Thank you very much, Attorney Kwan. So I hope you can look forward to a lot of students and members of the academic community and even fellow advocates or just people who are really interested in inspecting or investigating these interconnections. Our next question comes from Hazel Ugat from the chat, and they write, "Good afternoon. Just want to clarify the gender roles that you discussed. Are these only associated with women? How about its relation to the other genders in the spectrum in relation to climate change? Thank you."
That's a thank you very much for that question, Hazel. Yes, you are the current uh well, in terms of volume at least, much of the work that document the impact of that document the impact of climate change, at least as far as the gender aspect is concerned, a lot of them still just pertain to women. um uh I would not, of course, discount and in fact there are there would be differential impacts also, and for the other members of the members of the LGBTQ plus community. This is not very well documented as of yet. I'd say, at least in the work that I've been doing. It is a very interesting area that needs to be explored as far as research is concerned. Well, not only research, but also programming is concerned. But unfortunately, I haven't come across much documentation in terms of LGBT, the differential impacts of climate change to LGBT Q plus QIA plus members. But I would say that, of course, because of the of historical discrimination, inequalities that that members of or those who identify with different genders experience, this impacts would also have the impacts would also be different. So the current, at least my as far as my research is concerned, a lot of them would still be related to, or would still are still really concentrated on women. Yeah, should be something interesting to look at too. Thank you for that, though.
And thank you as well, Attorney Kwan. So for those who might be interested in pursuing this line of research, there is a research gap, something to be filled. And of course, like what we've gleaned from this session, something very, very important as well. So, for our next question, we are happy to have actually one of the co-chairs of the My Climate Risk Lighthouse activity, Dr. Theodore Shepard. So, Dr. Shepard would like to ask his question live. So, Dr. Shepard, thank you for joining us. We'll hand over the mic to you.
Thank you. And so, sorry, it's a bit long, so I thought I would ask it live. So I'm calling in from the University of Reading in England. Thank you very much for the very, very interesting talk. I've really enjoyed, I must say, all the Ateneo de Manila webinar series. They're really fantastic. I'm a climate scientist, but I have been talking to a few lawyers, and I wanted to ask you. I mean, you made a very compelling case, but I guess the question is, how effective are the legal systems going to be to help, enable climate action? And it'll be different depending on the different systems, I guess. And there's sort of two main lines that I can see. One is the sort of tort law approach, the liability, the damage aspect. Personally, I'm a bit skeptical of that as an approach, partly because it's the differential aspect of climate change, so it doesn't address existing vulnerability, and also rich lives are worth more than poor lives. So I think there's a real problem with that. So I think it seems to me, it's always seemed to me as a non-specialist, that the holding governments to account seems a much more powerful method, because human rights does seem to be the obvious thing, because governments claim to support human rights. They've signed human rights agreements and stuff. I guess some of the cases I've seen have focused on children. Actually, there was the one in the U.S., Juliana, that just got killed by Joe Biden. But and I guess that's easy. The argument is that children will be affected by climate change for a longer period of their life. And I guess everybody's sympathetic to children, so it has a kind of a appeal. I think women, I haven't seen much, although there is this Swiss group, but I think elderly Swiss women are probably not faced with the sort of challenges that you talked about in your talk. And I think they appeal to a very specific issue like health, where they could make some sort of evidence-based case. But I'm wondering, if you were really making the case you make, um, how receptive do you think governments would be, and what kind of fights might we, or pushback? Because I could imagine in the UK, people say, "Oh, that's too woke," Um, so do you want to think? I mean, what are your thoughts about the actual effectiveness of holding governments to account with this kind of argument? Do you think there is hope? Because at least I'm not aware that it's being tried.
Right. Thank you so much, Dr. Shepherd, for the intervention and the questions. Before I directly answer the points, or respond at least to the points, I would. This is something interesting, because you pointed out that the Swiss women have different concerns that I mentioned. Actually, in a body of research, because of the contexts that women find, the different contexts that women across the world that women find themselves in, the concerns actually do vary. In a lot of the developing nations, it's about food security, it's about gender-based violence, it's about lack of livelihood. But for the most part, in the more developed regions of the world, a lot of the documented concerns of women in relation to climate change are actually public participation issues, being represented in the discourse thereabouts. And of course, health of older persons would probably cut across, in varying degrees, that is. Yeah, that's actually a very good, I think, a nice point to make also in our conversation this afternoon. In relation to legal strategies, uh well, first of all, the eh, climate change related jurisprudence in relation to human rights is not a very it's not a field that's, or it's not an area that's very developed just yet. We are starting the tort liability the tort liability venue, if I may call it that, I think is I would actually agree that it's not a very comprehensive kind of thing. It just addresses the present. But for some people, it's actually, in at least what we have in most legal systems at this point, that is a useful approach if only to be able to get remediation or damages for victims. So it's a short-sighted, a bit effective, but not a very. It doesn't go back into, if you will, climate justice issues. In the Philippines, it is interesting to note that because you mentioned the case on children, we actually do have an environmental case that was decided quite early on, a couple of decades ago, which allowed the filing of a case on behalf of future generations. So it's fusing in the title of the case is Oposa versus Factoran. It talked about timber license agreements. They were seeking the cancellation of timber license agreements because the deforestation would affect future generations. The Supreme Court of the Philippines, in that very, I think, progressive decision, um, uh, recognize the ability to be able to sue, for present generations to have, well, in that case, parents of children to file on behalf of their children on behalf of a very familiar environmental law principle, intergenerational responsibility, which is also used, obviously, in the climate change discourse. So we have that. So the ability to file a suit on environmental cases, climate change related cases, the legal standing could be there. The legal standing is actually there. Another interesting development that happened a couple of years ago. Someone in the oh, Gwen, thank you very much. Someone in the chat mentioned uh Greenpeace Southeast Asia filed, well, initially a complaint before the Commission on Human Rights in the Philippines, against what we call carbon majors. These are the um uh, uh big companies that, emit the most greenhouse gases. And really, so the supposed case was for violations of human rights occasioned by these business activities. Obviously, the Commission on Human Rights is not a court. It's an independent body. So what the nice thing that the previous commission did, the fifth commission of the Commission on Human Rights, was that it took cognizance on the case, but did not treat it as a complaint as such, but continued on the investigation as part of its mandate to investigate human rights violations. So they were able to in a series of inquiries, they were able to bring in a couple many victims of human rights violations occasioned by environmental impacts and business activities of these carbon majors. And these were documented through reports issued by the Commission on Human Rights. This, I think, is a very good starting point to consider human rights impacts of climate change. But admittedly, just circling back to legal strategies, it would be nice to see a case being filed, especially at the domestic courts, and see how domestic courts would rule on this. International and regional courts, I think, could be more receptive. From my perspective, could be more receptive to these issues, because my observation is that a lot of regional courts, I would especially think of the European Court of Human Rights, having a more progressive stance on entertaining, at least, these more contemporary issues that affect human rights. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Attorney Kwan. And it seems that you were able to satisfy the curiosity of Dr. Shepard. And it's also good to be reminded of the landmark case of Oposa versus Factoran. Now, before we move on to the next question, we'd also like to thank Dr. Carcy Cruz for checking archeum.ateneo.edu for Attorney Kwan's work. So I will be sharing the link to his profile in the chat. The link is just a bit lengthy, but those who would like to explore are welcome to do so. Now, our next question comes from an anonymous sender, and they write, Good afternoon, Attorney Kwan. What role do international institutions play in shaping a gender-sensitive climate change discourse and policies?
Oh, a lot, a lot. You see, I think that the in many countries, the Philippines included, the discussion on gender in relation to climate change actually are born out of international agencies, the studies of international agencies. I mentioned earlier the initial study of the of the UN Human Rights Council pertaining to the relationship of human rights and climate change. That kind of started the ball rolling for other UN agencies and other international agencies and institutions to go more specific. There are now studies that talk about the relationship of climate change and children's rights, climate change and indigenous peoples. For example, UN Women has been quite active in producing studies that are related to gender and climate change. And thankfully, in more recent years, many international institutions have picked up this issue. And in fact, because of this of the work that many of these international agencies and institutions do, they are now we can probably these are also inspirations for not only local institutions but even educational institutions to look into including this as part of either a module or part of a course, and some probably can some actually offer courses that zero in on gender and climate change. In the law school, for example, our gender and the law class has an entire module or section that tackle precisely this. But of course, has a more kind of legal flavor to it. So there's that. So you circling back the question, these international institutions and agencies do play a big role because um uh you know how this idea, I mean, because they are able to document situations across the world. And when you see that a situation that you're experiencing in your own community, in your own country, could be the same as in another country, hey, this kind of merits as a second look.
Thank you very much, Attorney Kwan. Indeed, I guess you and I and the others who have also worked in this sustainability and resilience space can really think of very different cases, a lot of precedent where, it's not just the international that also affects the local, but also vice versa. So uh, we'd also like to thank Ms. Gwen from Green Research Ed for also sharing the executive summary of the NICC report on carbon majors in the chat. So if anyone in the audience is interested in reading more about this, you may download the file. So moving on to a question from Abby Valenzuela. They ask, how are we doing in terms of incorporating gender in climate action planning, such as in the NCCAP and the LCCAP, so the National Climate Change Adaptation Plan?
Yes, thank you very much for this question. I draw now experiences from my work with some local government units and well, doing research on this matter also. Our climate change adaptation plans, the current ones, both issued by the Climate Change Commission, those issued by the Climate Change Commission, and the National Disaster Risk Reduction and Management Council. All of these documents from a study that I I did before, they actually do incorporate or they at least follow the human rights based approach and gender mainstreaming. It's kind of all there. Um, Nice sounding plans. In terms of implementation, that is another issue. Um, uh, uh, at the national level, at the national policy level making, incorporating these concepts and these issues seem to be easier because uh the the I mean, it's easy to put them in plans. As they say, the devil is in the details. The problem actually lies with implementation at the ground level. When I was doing work with some local government units, or yeah, when I was helping some local government units craft their gender and development plans, as well as their in relation to their DRRM plans. Most of these, unfortunately, most of these local government units are lack capacity to actually translate the national level policies to concrete programs at the ground level. And I think this is where our work as researchers, as academics, come into play, because if we are able to translate these seemingly abstract concepts to more concrete plans and to more concrete solutions. These can actually affect real lives at the ground level. So when we so part of what we need to do is to capacitate actors at the grassroots level to be able to translate the nice sounding plans that are in the policies and that are included in the national policies and plans, so that these can benefit people on the ground.
Thank you very much, Attorney Kwan. Indeed, although we have a lot of nice sounding plans up above in the national, it's really in the local scale where change really happens or does not happen. So really, another research gap. Again, if we have anyone in the audience who is interested in pursuing this thread, that is a very real gap that we in the Philippines could benefit from addressing more. So unfortunately, this is all the time that we have for the open forum. I guess I'd just like to close by reading out the comment of Dr. Carcy Cruz, which is, I think, a nice way as well to wrap up this open forum. And she says that I am a fan of Vandana Shiva and her work in fighting biopiracy and bioprospecting done by multinational companies, and how she has protected seeds and indigenous farmers, which include women, by filing cases to question patents on ancient seeds, especially the resilient seeds that survive extreme winter. So thank you for that bit of reflection that we can come away with, Dr. Carcy Cruz. And of course, thank you, Attorney Kwan, for your answers. And of course, to our audience, thank you for this very lively exchange, this very lively open forum. At this point, I'd like us to move on now to the awarding of the certificate. We present this certificate of appreciation to Attorney Ryan Jeremiah Donato Kwan for sharing his time and insights in the webinar entitled Gendering Climate Change Impacts, Placing Women's Human Rights at the Forefront on the 3rd of May, 2024. The certificate is signed by Ms. Jean Hardelesa Mijares, the Program Manager for Climate and Disaster Resilience at the Ateneo Institute of Sustainability, and by Dr. Charlotte Kendra Gotanco Gonzalez, the Director of AIS and the focal point of the My Climate Risk Ateneo de Manila University Regional Hub. Thank you very much again, Attorney Kwan, for sharing your time and insights with us.
Yes,
And
thank you
to
very much.
draw our thank you, thank you, Attorney Kwan. And to draw our program to a close, we would like to invite Ms. Aina B. Martin, the Hub Companion at the University Gender Hub and the Senior High School Gender Hub representative of the Ateneo de Manila University.
Good afternoon, everyone. I would like to begin by expressing my deep gratitude to Attorney Ryan Kwan for indeed fine-tuning our environmental lenses, or specifically for highlighting and including the experiences of women, our needs, in the environmental and climate conversation. So, as a woman who has engaged in environmental activities herself prior to my work in Ateneo, I would just like to add to some point that you mentioned on the effects of the lack of women in decision-making conversations, specifically how it impact disaster risk management, affect strategies and plans. That when you mentioned how relief goods often forget to include sanitary hygiene, I remembered the experience of being a woman, seeing how go bags often seem to forget to include sanitary napkins as well. And again, it's very simple, but as a requirement of something that households and schools should have, that even as simple as that, women should be included as well. So maybe just something to think about. So indeed, yes, climate change is not gender neutral, and climate change affects women differently. Historically, as mentioned, women have been at a disadvantage in various life aspects: education, opportunities, right to safety, right to a safe environment. And while acknowledging the perhaps psychological impact this gender based discrimination can have on women, and I'd just like to mention, as I've seen in my psychological work with women, specifically with women experiences of sexual gender based violence, that while that is true, women also do know strength. Women also do know agency. Women know nurturance and care. Perhaps it's this unique, unfortunate experience of women that allows us, to perhaps intuitively understand and connect with our presently suffering natural environment. Perhaps an area for research. And so while we've placed women's specific human rights, women's specific needs at the forefront this afternoon, I would just like to adjunct another aspect of this conversation to share how some leading personalities in climate justice the recent years have been women. Perhaps we all know Greta Thunberg, Carmela Bagum, if you're familiar with her, young Filipina from Negros region, a fisheries technologist recognized by Michelle Obama for her conservation work. Ana Oposa, related to attorney, Chief Mermaid, as she's called, advocates for marine conservation and environmental awareness amongst the youth. And one of my personal favorites, Dr. Jane Goodall, who revolutionized the conservation of chimpanzees by, short of saying, treating them with due respect and care too. And the list goes on. So admittedly, I believe women who are also present in this Zoom call are breaking these stereotypes by merely showing up to this conversation. Show all of us here that women can engage in climate justice acts. Women can engage in promoting environmental conservation, and that women can pursue STEM. So I just like to end simply with, I was reminded of a quote by Dr. Jane Goodall that change happens by listening and then starting a dialogue with the people who are doing something that we don't believe is right. And we're far from meeting that parity, gender parity. What we are in this conversation, and I would hope that we continue to engage in this conversation, that we continue to engage with women, include women, and support women's initiatives as we all work to strive towards climate justice for all. Thank you and good afternoon.
Thank you very much, Ms. Martin, for that very wonderful wrap up of our session. Truly adopting that human rights based approach, one that is genuinely and truly inclusive and considers everyone, is something that we can embody in our everyday lives. Because we will not solve the wicked problems of the world around us without bringing half the population with us. So now, before we officially let everyone go, I hope that I can request everyone to momentarily turn on their cameras for a group photo. This will also serve as our documentation for the event. So I'll give a few moments for everyone else to turn on their cameras. We have a nice tight group with us today. So I will be taking a photo of the first frame in 3, 2, 1. Thank you. Just taking a second photo of the second frame. Please keep your smiles on. And in 3, 2, 1. Thank you very much, everyone. It's wonderful to see your smiling faces and really put a face to the names that occasionally join us, and even those who are joining us for the first time. Now, before we close, we would like to share another initiative that you may be interested in if you would like to be involved in another way with the Ateneo Hub of My Climate Risk. And this is what we call the Climate Stories Initiative. Each of us has our own climate stories, and we have all experienced the impacts of climate change one way or another. In fact, if you're in the tropical region right now, we are all experiencing very high temperatures that are very unpleasant. And so the Hub has launched this initiative grounded on the belief that we are all storytellers and we are all scientists. So we'd love to read or see your story. And this is also an open call for submissions, especially as we seek to elevate the Southeast Asian voice on the experience of climate change. So if you're interested in submitting, the tech team has posted the link in the chat, but you may also access the links through the slide. And of course, we cannot let you go without first talking about evaluations. So to our dear participants, we would very much appreciate it if you could answer the evaluation survey through the QR code and link flashed on screen. Requests for e-certificates may be coursed through the same form, and certificates of participation will be sent in the following week. Thank you once again. Our gratitude goes out to Attorney Kwan for this amazing session. And of course, our gratitude as well to our Filipino Sign Language interpreters, Miss Edna Comia and Miss Annalisa Regis Tolentino. They always make these events of ours more inclusive and in that way more sustainable as well. And of course, to our audience, thank you very much for your participation in this webinar. We hope that you've gained fresh insights on the different interconnections between climate impact and gender, and how all of these fit into the larger question of climate justice. Please don't forget to accomplish the event evaluation form. Our tech team has also posted the link in the chat. And again, e-certificates may requests for e-certificates may be coursed through the same form. Now, earlier, Attorney Kwan did mention that he was sandwiched between two sessions. And of course, as I mentioned earlier, this is our penultimate session. So we hope to see you again in our next webinar, which is happening next Wednesday. It's our final webinar of the climate research series, where we will tackle the policy side of an energy transition and what that looks like for the Philippines. That's on the 8th of May, 4 to 5:30 p.m. Philippine Standard Time, with Dr. Mahalea Ravago, Associate Professor at the Department of Economics and concurrently the President of the Development Academy of the Philippines. You may register for the next session in our link tree. So thank you very much, everyone, and enjoy the rest of your day.